Let's dive into the spells of the Ku Klux Klan. First, let's look at some of the key figures of the Ku Klux Klan or KKK. Thomas Frederick Dixon Jr., born in 1864 and dying in 1946, was an American Baptist minister, politician, lawyer, lecturer, writer, whose book The Klansman brought the KKK to new audiences. Dixon was born in Shelby, North Carolina, the son of Thomas Frederick Dixon Sr. and his wife, Amanda McAfee. She was the daughter of a planter from York County, South Carolina. Dixon was one of 8 children, of whom 5 survived to adulthood, and watching his siblings die affected him immensely. The 5 remaining Dixon siblings carried a deep need to help others. His elder brother, preacher Amzie Clarence Dixon, helped to edit the Fundamentals, a series of articles and later volumes influential in fundamentalist Christianity. He won international acclaim as one of the greatest ministers of his day. His younger brother, Frank Dixon, was also a preacher and a lecturer, and his younger sister, Elizabeth Delia Dixon Carroll, was a pioneer woman physician in North Carolina. She was the head doctor for many years of Meredith College in Raleigh. We will focus on her a bit later. Dixon's father was the son of an English-Scottish father and a German mother. He was a well-known Baptist minister, and Dixon took his heritage very seriously. In his adolescence, Dixon helped on the family farms, an experience he hated, but he later said it helped him relate to the working man. He saw the impact Sherman's ripping up of the train lines across the South had on local economy, as crops languished in the fields and Southerners starved. When leaders were put on trial and found to be innocent after the Civil War, such as Georgia's Confederate governor Joseph E. Brown, he returned to Georgia to try to get the state back into shape, but he was arrested and sent to D.C. to languish in jail, so there was a real vacuum of leaders. It's estimated up to 40,000 Georgians starved during Reconstruction. The Reconstruction implemented by Congress, which lasted from 1866 to 1877, was aimed at reorganizing the South after the Civil War, imposing martial law, and providing the means for readmitting these states into the Union, usually by demanding money to pay war debt. Reconstruction was a vast humiliation ritual, where the entire South Carolina Congress was replaced by those who forcefully imposed a Freedmen's Bureau, a wide-reaching welfare office on South Carolinians, seeing a further dip in its economy since people didn't have to work for a living. In the first Reconstruction South Carolina House of Representatives, there were 94 black congressmen and 30 white congressmen, 23 of these not from South Carolina. So in their whole House, only 7 had any Confederate voice at all. When Dixon became a lawyer, he was one of the few public voices that championed Confederate veteran rights, including the funding of their veterans' homes. North Carolina fought very hard against martial law imposed by the federal government starting in 1865. Before leaving the state, Union General Sherman left General John M. Schofield in charge of North Carolina, with orders to maintain law and order through military rule. It was under these circumstances, with the South under military rule by a Union general, that President Johnson took over the task of bringing these rebellious states back into the Union. President Johnson issued 2 proclamations in May 1865. The first applied to all Southern states, and the other applied to North Carolina alone. The Amnesty Proclamation offered a pardon to all Southerners, except those in positions of leadership and extreme wealth, provided they swore an oath of loyalty to the United States and the U.S. Constitution. It also allowed those who swore allegiance to retain all their property except for slaves. If they swore an oath to the Union, they would also be able to vote. If men hadn't sworn that oath, the white Southern vote probably would have been lost forever. The second proclamation appointed William W. Holden as the provisional governor of North Carolina. President Johnson ordered Holden to call a state convention to restore North Carolina to the Union, as North Carolina maintained its refusal to join even after the Civil War. Johnson's plan required that this convention repeal the Ordinance of Secession, ratify the 13th Amendment, and cancel the Confederate war debt. The convention would also provide for the election of a new governor, state legislatures, and U.S. congressmen, thereby establishing civil government in a state that had no little to no ties to North Carolina. This convention was set to convene in October 1865. But this wasn't good enough for the liberals of the time. At the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Raleigh, the Convention of the Freedmen of North Carolina was led by James Hood, a missionary from Connecticut. This group consisted of approximately 100 men and Northerners who came to North Carolina to help the freedmen, quote, adjust to their new status, otherwise known as carpetbaggers. Since the freedmen were barred from participation in the convention, they took this opportunity to riot and express their desire for 3 constitutional rights for blacks: the right to vote, the right of judicial equality in the form of admission of black testimony in court, and the right to seats on a jury. They were not successful, but the Freedmen's Convention resolved to form itself into the North Carolina State Equal Rights League, a sort of early NGO which would influence North Carolina school curricula for decades to come. Jonathan Worth, a provisional treasurer of North Carolina who argued North Carolina would never be able to pay anyone's war debt since no factories had reopened in 1865 with millions of men dead, ran against Sherman's man and won governorship. A growing Republican faction within the United States Congress believed Congress, and not the president, should make the decisions about when and how to admit the southern states. As a result, Congress refused to seat North Carolina's newly elected representatives and senators, as well as those from other southern states. This congressional or radical reconstruction would delay North Carolina's readmittance to the Union for 2.5 years, leading to serious legislative delays and a lack of resources for North Carolinians. This was the environment Dixon grew up in. He was told to work his family's fields, to feed carpetbaggers and Northerners who would not even admit his own state to Congress after Civil War defeat. The federal government confiscated the farmland of his neighbors if they refused to take the oath, as they had lost sons and had no one to defend these properties. In Columbia, South Carolina, in about 1868, Dixon witnessed a black driver of a truck strike a little white boy of about 6 with a whip. The victim's mother rebuked him, so she was arrested, and he followed them into a courtroom where a black magistrate fined her $10 for insulting a freedman. His uncle and a friend paid the fine for the woman. One of the few groups at the time who had some semblance of stability was the KKK. Dixon's father and his maternal uncle, Colonel Leroy McAfee, both joined the Klan early in the Reconstruction era with the aim of bringing order to the tumultuous times which included the rape of women and minors by foreign Union troops, as at least a third of the Union Army was foreign-born. You can learn more about this in the Heir of Mount Vernon video on this channel. In 1869, Dixon watched with his own eyes as a black rapist was hung from the town square by his uncle. His uncle was very proud of his Scottish heritage, and the Klansman was dedicated to the memory of a Scotch-Irish leader of the South, my uncle, Colonel Leroy McAfee, Grand Titan of the Invisible Empire Ku Klux Klan. Scottish pagan tradition would find its way into many KKK rituals and spells. One such ritual is the infamous cross burning. Various members of the mass media have argued that this shows the Christian nationalist connection to the KKK. But that's not true. Burning crosses is a centuries-old Scottish practice, so clans could send messages to each other across foggy lochs. It has been described by Sir Walter Scott, among many others in their books, for centuries. It has very little religious meaning and simply serves as a method of communication. Another argument from the mass media is that due to the involvement of preachers in the KKK, it must be some sort of Christian organization. But this is false. The KKK and its book, the Koran, which is available to read online, is almost entirely pagan. In Reconstruction, people looked to community figures such as reverends and preachers due to the starvation, rape, unemployment, and overall instability of their communities. The KKK membership reflects the communal atmosphere rather than any religion in particular. As a special student in history and politics at Wake Forest, where he had an impeccable academic record, Dixon felt the influence of Herbert Baxter Adams and his circle of Anglo-Saxon historians, who sought to trace American political institutions back to the primitive democracy of ancient Germanic tribes. Dixon remains frightening to the public of today because of his eloquence. His speeches and writing have survived centuries. At his height in the late 1890s, he spoke to 5 million Americans on his lecture circuit tours. When we look at publications of the KKK, such as 1916's Koran, we see a set of words and terms that are not English and seemingly made up. KKK meetings include a sacred altar, four-cornered, and an officer who approaches it with a sheathed sword and flag shortly after an introduction and induction of new members. The sword and the staff are ancient Irish symbols of power, and they are to be laid on a four-cornered table with a stone and a goblet before and during spell making. You can learn about this practice in the writing of Yeats. Unlike the Irish tradition, the KKK Scottish tradition sees the sword sheathed. The KKK sacred altar also features the fiery cross, which the Klan members light themselves. They consider this a pure symbol, which will light the way of any Klansman. In the introduction, there is no mention of God, and instead the prayers mention country, family, name, and home. KKK members circle around the sacred altar, with one leader rapping it with a gavel after the prayers are said. In the service, the KKK designates themselves as members of Knights, of an invisible empire struggling against an alien world. The emphasis is on fraternity and brotherhood, with hand signals and the like occurring in the opening ceremony. In the closing ceremony, there is a prayer to God. This sort of clashes with Klan vocabulary, as high-ranking members of the Klan are wizards, which is a pagan title. There is also the Klan excellency, Cyclops, which refers to Greek mythology, and Titan, referred to by Dixon. The patterns of the Roman Empire with its knights and centurions appear here and there in Klan knighthood ceremonies. There is a lot of Freemasonry overlap with signals and countersignals, reflecting the common Scottish vein of the two groups. But where the Klan seems to differentiate is this underlining need for community. The establishment of many of these rituals was in the face of a huge onslaught on the South, politically, economically, and culturally. So Klan members are told to be constantly clannish towards each other, each other's families, and communities. To not do so would be to face ruin at the hands of globalism. Dixon considered communism one of the scourges of the world. The Koran is a document from 1916. Back in 1905, when Dixon was writing about the Klan rituals, they could have been very different. Dixon distanced himself from the bigotry of the revived second-era Ku Klux Klan, which he saw as a growing menace to the cause of law and order, and its members unprincipled marauders, and they, in turn, attacked Dixon. So it's possible this Koran is totally against what Dixon and his uncle implemented decades earlier. Dixon recorded this schism in his 1907 novel, The Traitor. We see changes in the documents throughout time. For example, in 1916, the Klan wears helmets, but at some point this changed to hoods, potentially influenced by Spanish Christianity and their Easter celebration, as the Spanish flu took hold of many southern communities in the late 1910s, and understanding Spanish culture would have been a part of combating that epidemic. However, so influenced was the Klan by the betrayal of the federal government in Reconstruction, this belief made it into the Koran of 1916 and is reflected in its first lecture, K Uno. The document is an important one because it offers a first-hand look into Reconstruction, which is very difficult to find. There are also many first-hand accounts of KKK spells still existing. For example, the use of little voodoo paper dolls hung from trees to protect property, which may reflect an African voodoo influence from New Orleans rather than the Scottish and Irish traditions of North and South Carolina. Now let's turn to the Klansman's Better Angel, which was the subject of a medium piece by Wilhelm Kuhner. Elizabeth Delia Dixon Carroll was a modern in the finest sense of the word, an admirer of modern ways, fashions, and schools of thought, according to her pastor, Reverend Edwin McNeil Poteet, Jr., which he stated in his memorial address at the tribute to her by students, alumni, faculty, and trustees at Meredith College, the Baptist female university opened in 1891 in downtown Raleigh. A significant public figure in North Carolina when the car her husband was driving was struck by another. Her demand for suffrage shows the diversity of thought in 20th century Southland. Elizabeth Dixon was utterly impatient of the things that cramp and devitalize life, which made her militant even to the point of differing with those closest to her, including her brothers. Her deep reverence for things of the spirit found expression in being and doing rather than in talking about her convictions. An accomplished physician and director of medical services, professor of physiology and hygiene, and infirmary physician at Meredith College for 35 years, Dr. Dixon Carroll was the first and only female physician in Raleigh at the time and a member of the American Medical Association, the North Carolina Medical Society, and the Raleigh Academy of Medicine. She conducted chapel services at Meredith College, taught classes there, rendered medical aid to the students, survived the 1918 Spanish flu, and mingled with her students in their daily life. Her keen sense of humor and her absolute frankness, Catherine Mosley said in her student tribute to Dr. Dixon Carroll in 1934, together with her wide variety of interests in political and social problems, made her chapel talks and class discussions deeply interesting. In the fall of 1918, when the influenza was overwhelming our state and city like a great deluge, Dr. Carroll so carefully guarded the health of the students and directed their exercise that not a single case developed at the college until after the girls returned from the Christmas vacation. Even then, only a few cases of the disease developed among the students from exposures while at their homes, and none of these proved at all serious, according to the Meredith trustees of 1934. In 1920, Dr. Dixon campaigned for the Democrats statewide with another Shelby native, then Lieutenant Governor O. Max Gardner, and urged women to stand by the Globalist League of Nations. The Charlotte News described her as a militant member of the party and the sister of Dr. Thomas Dixon, who has built plays and books on Southern democratic principles. Her world believed it sinful for a woman to speak in church. She believed it necessary for the voice of women to be raised often and in many places. So she braved both orthodoxy and political suspicion and became a force among the politically minded women of her state. Her world believed in original sin and its inevitable issue. She believed there was more in sin than a theological predisposition, and therefore advocated new treatments for women criminals and put girls into Samarkand Manor when some of her friends would have put them in perdition. The popularity of Dixon led in part to the popularity of the Klansmen, and so we see in Dixon the importance of women to political movements. Her desire to join the League of Nations sees the start of a new Southern movement which would be championed by Dixiecrats, these individuals who saw the need for federal money to lift up their states and realized they would have to play nice for it. As Faulkner said, "The past isn't over, it isn't even past."